Marcus Chun had always been terrible with names, faces, and especially royal protocols. Standing in the grand reception hall of the Zephyrian diplomatic station, he tugged nervously at his collar while watching dozens of alien dignitaries mingle in what appeared to be carefully choreographed social patterns. The Universal Translation Council had sent him here as a cultural liaison, though he suspected it was more punishment than promotion after his incident with the Regellian ambassador's ceremonial headpiece. The station itself was a marvel of engineering, suspended in the neutral zone between three different star systems. Crystalline walls curved upward into impossible geometries, while bioluminescent plants from a dozen worlds cast shifting patterns of light across the floor. The air hummed with the quiet efficiency of advanced technology, punctuated by the melodic conversations of beings from across the galaxy. Marcus had spent the last 3 hours trying to avoid making eye contact with anyone important, which in a room full of galactic nobility was proving increasingly difficult. His briefing materials lay forgotten in his quarters, victims of his chronic procrastination and a particularly engaging human mystery novel he discovered in the station's library. The Zephyrians were hosting this gathering to celebrate the signing of the Meridian Accords, a trade agreement that would reshape commerce across 17 star systems. As the newest species to join the Galactic Council, humanity had earned the right to send a representative, though Marcus was beginning to suspect they'd drawn the short straw when they'd selected him. A gentle chime filled the air, and the conversations gradually died down. Near the far end of the hall, a section of the crystalline wall dissolved, revealing an alcove that Marcus hadn't noticed before. From within stepped a figure that immediately commanded attention. She was tall, perhaps 7 feet in height, with skin that seemed to absorb and reflect light in equal measure. Her movements were fluid, almost hypnotic, and she wore what appeared to be living fabric that shifted colors as she walked. Most striking were her eyes, which held depths that seemed to contain entire star fields. Marcus found himself staring, then caught himself, and looked away, then found himself staring again. Around him, other beings were performing what he assumed were various forms of respectful acknowledgement. Some bowed, others made complex gestures with multiple limbs, and a few simply stood in perfect stillness. The tall figure moved through the crowd with practiced grace, exchanging what appeared to be ritual greetings with various dignitaries. Marcus tried to blend into the background, positioning himself near a decorative fountain that seemed to flow upward rather than down. Unfortunately, his attempt at invisibility was thwarted by his fundamental misunderstanding of Zephyrian architecture. What he'd assumed was a decorative fountain was actually a ceremonial focal point, and by standing near it, he'd inadvertently placed himself in a position of prominence. The tall figure approached, and Marcus realized with growing horror that she was heading directly toward him. He glanced around desperately, hoping to spot an escape route, but found himself surrounded by other dignitaries who had formed a respectful circle around the fountain area. As she drew closer, Marcus could see intricate patterns in her skin that seemed to shift like living tattoos. Her presence was both calming and intimidating, carrying an authority that spoke of centuries of leadership. When she stopped directly in front of him, Marcus felt every eye in the room focus on their interaction. She spoke in a voice like wind chimes caught in a gentle breeze, the words automatically translated by his neural implant. "Representative of humanity, you honor us with your presence at this gathering." Marcus's mind went completely blank. All his diplomatic training, what little he'd absorbed of it, evaporated like morning mist. He was supposed to say something formal, something that acknowledged her status and importance, but instead what came out of his mouth was pure, unfiltered honesty. "You have really beautiful eyes," he said. The silence that followed was so profound that Marcus could hear his own heartbeat. Around the circle, beings from a dozen different species froze in positions of absolute shock. Some of the smaller creatures actually took a step backward, while others made what Marcus assumed were protective gestures. The tall figure herself seemed momentarily stunned, her star-field eyes widening slightly. For a moment that felt like an eternity, she simply stared at him. Then, something unexpected happened. A sound emerged from her throat, soft at first but growing stronger. It took Marcus a moment to realize she was laughing. The sound was like silver bells mixed with flowing water, completely unlike any laughter he'd ever heard but unmistakably joyful. "Say it again," she said, her voice carrying a note of what sounded suspiciously like delight. Marcus blinked, certain he'd misheard. "I'm sorry. What you just said. Say it again." Her eyes seemed to sparkle with something that looked remarkably like amusement. Around them, the circle of dignitaries remained frozen in shock. Marcus caught a glimpse of what appeared to be a Centaurian diplomat making frantic gestures that his translator helpfully informed him meant catastrophic protocol violation. Marcus stammered. "I said you have beautiful eyes?" The laughter came again, richer this time. "Yes, that. No one has said such a thing to me in 300 years. 300 years. Marcus squeaked, his voice cracking like a teenager's. "I am Queen Lorelei of the Zephyrian Dominion," she said, and Marcus felt his stomach drop to somewhere around his knees. "And you, Marcus Chun of Earth, have just paid me the most refreshing compliment I have received in centuries." Marcus tried to bow, stumbled slightly, and nearly knocked over what turned out to be a priceless ceremonial vessel. Queen Lorelei steadied him with one graceful hand, her touch surprisingly warm. "Your Majesty," Marcus managed, his face burning with embarrassment. "I had no idea. I should have known. I'm supposed to be a cultural liaison, and you just spoke honestly," the Queen interrupted. "Do you know how rare that is in diplomatic circles? How refreshing it is to hear words that come from genuine reaction rather than calculated political maneuvering." Around them, the other dignitaries were beginning to recover from their shock, though many still looked as though they expected Marcus to spontaneously combust at any moment. "In my culture," Queen Lorelei continued, "we value honesty above all else. Yet paradoxically, the higher one rises in status, the less honest communication one receives. Everyone is so concerned with protocol and propriety that they forget the simple pleasure of genuine interaction." Marcus nodded, though he wasn't sure if agreeing with her assessment was diplomatically appropriate. "I'm really sorry if I offended." "Offended?" The Queen's laughter returned. "Marcus Chin of Earth, you have done the opposite. You have reminded me why I became interested in your species in the first place." "Our species?" "Humans," she said, her eyes taking on that distant quality again. "You are all so wonderfully unpredictable. Your diplomatic corps sends us formal proposals written with such careful precision that they could be generated by computers. Yet here you stand, speaking from the heart without a thought for consequences. It's utterly refreshing." Marcus wasn't sure whether to be flattered or insulted by the characterization of his species as unpredictable. "We do try to follow proper protocol," he said weakly. "Protocol has its place," Queen Lorelei acknowledged, "but it should not replace authentic communication. Tell me, Marcus Chun, what do you think of our gathering tonight?" The question caught him off guard again. He glanced around the magnificent hall, taking in the incredible architecture, the diverse assembly of beings, and the obvious importance of the occasion. His diplomat training whispered that he should praise everything lavishly and find something profound to say about interstellar cooperation. Instead, he found himself being honest again. "It's intimidating," he admitted. "I feel completely out of my depth. Everyone else seems to know exactly what to do and say, and I'm just trying not to break anything or accidentally insult anyone." "Well, more than I already have." The Queen tilted her head, studying him with those remarkable eyes. "And yet you're more interesting to speak with than anyone else I have encountered tonight. Perhaps being out of one's depth is not entirely a bad thing." "I'm not sure my superiors would agree," Marcus said, imagining the report he would have to file about this conversation. "Your superiors sent you here for a reason," Queen Lorelei observed. "Perhaps they knew exactly what they were doing." Before Marcus could respond to that unsettling thought, a soft chime indicated that the formal portion of the evening was about to begin. The Queen glanced toward the center of the hall, where a raised dais had somehow appeared while they were talking. "The ceremony begins," she said, "but I hope we will have an opportunity to continue this conversation. It has been far too long since someone surprised me." She began to move toward the dais, then paused and turned back. "Marcus Chun of Earth, would you care to accompany me for the signing ceremony? As my guest." Marcus felt every pair of eyes in the room focus on him again. The invitation was clearly a tremendous honor, but it also meant he would be in the spotlight for the entire ceremony. His natural instinct was to politely decline and fade back into the crowd. Instead, he heard himself saying, "I would be honored, Your Majesty." Queen Lyralii smiled, and Marcus realized that her expression was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. Not just because of her exotic features or the way her skin seemed to glow with internal light, but because it was completely genuine. As they walked toward the center of the hall together, Marcus became aware of the murmur of conversations starting up around them. He caught fragments through his translator, unprecedented, fascinating development, and what sounded like several different ways of expressing shock in languages he didn't recognize. The queen seemed completely unbothered by the attention, moving with the same fluid grace she displayed throughout the evening. Marcus tried to match her composure, and only partially succeeded. "Tell me," she said quietly as they approached the dais, "what made you choose diplomatic service?" It was another question that demanded honesty rather than a prepared response. Marcus thought about it as they climbed the steps to the raised platform. "I wanted to see the stars," he said finally. "I grew up reading about other worlds, other civilizations, and I thought diplomacy would be a way to experience all of that firsthand. Though I'm beginning to think I might not have the right temperament for it. Because you speak honestly instead of politically? Because I seem to specialize in making mistakes?" Marcus replied. Queen Lyralii took her place at a curved podium that had been crafted from what appeared to be crystallized starlight. "Marcus Chun of Earth," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the hall, "I believe you may discover that what you consider mistakes, others might view as unexpected gifts." The ceremony began with a complex ritual that involved representatives from each of the 17 systems placing their marks on a document that existed in 17 different dimensions simultaneously. Marcus tried to follow along, but found himself distracted by the elegance of the proceedings and the strange beauty of the various alien dignitaries. When it came time for the Earth representative to sign, Marcus realized with growing alarm that everyone was looking at him expectantly. He glanced at Queen Lyralii, who nodded encouragingly. "The honor belongs to humanity's representative," she said gently. Marcus approached the signing platform on unsteady legs, wondering if there was a correct way to hold the stylus he'd been handed. The document itself seemed to shift and change as he looked at it, text appearing in his native language before cycling through what he assumed were the other 16 official languages of the Accords. He signed his name with as much care as he could manage, acutely aware that this moment would be recorded in history. When he finished, the assembled dignitaries burst into what sounded like applause, though some of the sounds were unlike anything in Marcus's experience. As the ceremony concluded and the formal portion of the evening wound down, Queen Lyralii approached him once more. "You handled that admirably," she said. "I just signed my name." Marcus protested. "You represented your species with dignity and authenticity," she corrected. "That is far more valuable than perfect protocol adherence." Marcus found himself studying her face, noting the way her expressions seemed to contain depths he couldn't quite fathom. "Your Majesty, may I ask you something?" "Of course. Why were you so pleased when I complimented your eyes? I mean, aside from the novelty of someone being that tactless." Queen Lyralii was quiet for a moment, her gaze turning distant. In Zephyrian culture, the eyes are considered the window to one's essence. To compliment someone's eyes is to acknowledge their inner beauty, their spiritual depth. But more than that, she paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "It has been a very long time since anyone looked at me and saw me rather than my crown." Marcus felt something shift in his understanding, both of her reaction and of the evening's events. I had no idea about the cultural significance. I meant what I said. I know, she replied softly. That's what made it so precious. The conversation was interrupted by the approach of what Marcus assumed was some sort of aide or advisor, a being with multiple eyes and an expression that suggested urgent business. Queen Lorelei listened to a rapid exchange in what Marcus's translator identified as diplomatic Zephyrian, too formal and quick for full translation. Her expression grew serious. I'm afraid duty calls, she said, turning back to Marcus. But before I go, I have a proposition for you. Marcus waited, not trusting himself to speak. The Meridian Accords require ongoing oversight and coordination between our worlds. Earth will need a permanent cultural liaison station here on the diplomatic station. Would you be interested in the position? Marcus felt the ground shift beneath his feet. A permanent posting meant leaving Earth behind, committing to a life among the stars he dreamed of seeing. It also meant working closely with beings whose customs he barely understood, representing humanity in ways he'd never imagined. I would need to consider it carefully, he managed. Queen Lorelei smiled, that genuine smile again. Of course. Take all the time you need. Though I hope your decision will be favorable. I find myself looking forward to more honest conversations. As she glided away to attend to her urgent business, Marcus stood alone in the gradually emptying hall, his mind reeling with the implications of the evening's events. He'd come to the gathering expecting to simply observe and try not to embarrass himself. Instead, he'd accidentally complimented an alien queen, been invited to participate in a historic ceremony, and offered a position that would change the course of his entire life. Looking up at the station's transparent ceiling, where the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, Marcus realized that perhaps being out of one's depth wasn't the worst place to be. Perhaps it was exactly where the most interesting discoveries waited to be made. 3 weeks had passed since the signing ceremony, and Marcus found himself settling into what he tentatively accepted as his new role aboard the diplomatic station. His quarters were modest, but comfortable, with a viewport that offered a stunning view of the nebula that served as the system's backdrop. Each morning, he woke to the sight of swirling colors that defied earthly description, and each evening, he fell asleep to the gentle hum of the station systems. The work itself was proving more complex than he'd anticipated. As the human cultural liaison, Marcus was responsible for interpreting Earth customs and values for other species, while simultaneously helping human visitors understand the intricate web of alien protocols that govern life on the station. It was a delicate balance, made more challenging by his growing realization that human behavior often puzzled other species as much as their customs confused him. Queen Lorelei had become a regular part of his routine, though their meetings maintained a careful formality that felt both natural and frustrating. She would stop by his office every few days to discuss various aspects of the Meridian Accords, their conversations ranging from trade regulations to cultural exchange programs. Marcus had learned to prepare for these visits, keeping his tendency toward blunt honesty in check, while trying to provide useful insights into human perspective. Today's meeting was different, however. Instead of arriving at his office, Queen Lorelei had requested that he join her in what she called the Memory Gardens, a section of the station he'd never visited. Following the directions she'd provided, Marcus made his way through corridors that gradually became more organic in design, the crystalline walls giving way to something that looked almost like living wood. He found the gardens tucked away in a section of the station that felt completely separate from the bustling diplomatic areas. The space was vast, filled with plants and trees from dozens of different worlds, each section carefully climate-controlled to match the needs of its inhabitants. Paths wound between groves of silver-leaf trees that chimed softly in an artificial breeze, past pools where bioluminescent fish swam in lazy circles, through meadows of grass that felt like silk beneath his feet. Queen Lorelei was waiting near a grove of trees that seemed to be made of crystallized light, their branches reaching toward a carefully crafted sky that mimicked the dawn light of her homeworld. She was dressed more simply than usual, in flowing robes that shifted from deep blue to silver as she moved. For the first time since he'd met her, she looked almost relaxed. "Marcus," she said, turning as he approached. "Thank you for coming. I thought it was time you saw this place." "It's incredible," Marcus said, and meant it. "I had no idea the station contained anything like this." "Few do," she replied. The memory gardens were created as a place of reflection, where residents of the station could find peace among reminders of their homeworlds. Each section represents a different world that contributes to the diplomatic community here. They began walking along one of the winding paths, past a section where Marcus glimpsed what appeared to be singing crystals and another where flowers bloomed and closed in accelerated cycles. "Is there a section for Earth?" Marcus asked. Queen Lyralii smiled. "There will be. Part of your role here involves helping to design it. Though I confess, I'm curious about what you would choose to represent your world." Marcus considered the question as they walked. "That's harder than it sounds. Earth is so diverse. How do you capture the essence of an entire world in a single garden space?" "That," Queen Lyralii said, "is exactly the right question to ask. Many species make the mistake of trying to represent everything. The most successful sections focus on capturing the spirit of a world rather than its surface appearance. They paused near a section dominated by towering structures that looked like frozen waterfalls. The crystalline formations caught and refracted light in patterns that seemed almost musical. "This represents my home world," Queen Lyralii said quietly. "Zephyr Prime has cities built into crystal canyons, where the wind creates symphony as it flows through carved passages. These formations capture that sound, that sense of harmony between natural forces and conscious design." Marcus listened to the gentle music emanating from the crystals, understanding now why the queen's voice reminded him of wind chimes. "It's beautiful, and it makes sense for your people's aesthetic." "You see it clearly," she observed. "Many visitors appreciate the beauty, but miss the deeper meaning. Tell me, what would you choose to represent humanity?" The question had been building in Marcus's mind since they'd entered the gardens, but giving voice to the answer felt presumptuous. "I keep thinking about diversity," he said finally. "Not just biological diversity, but the way humans can be completely different from each other while still being recognizably human. We're contradictory in ways that seem to puzzle other species." Queen Lyralii nodded thoughtfully. "Your species does present fascinating contradictions. You're capable of remarkable cruelty and extraordinary kindness, often within the same individual. You're highly social creatures who prize individualism. You're afraid of the unknown, but compulsively driven to explore it." "Exactly," Marcus said, warming to the topic. "And I think that's what makes us us. We're not a species that can be easily categorized or predicted. Even we don't fully understand ourselves most of the time. And how would you represent that in a garden?" Marcus paused, struck by sudden inspiration. "A maze," he said, "but not just any maze. One where the paths change based on the choices visitors make. Where you might find completely different destinations depending on how you approach the same intersection. Beautiful, but unpredictable. Logical, but only if you understand that the logic might shift without warning." Queen Lyralii stopped walking and turned to look at him directly. "That," she said, "is brilliant. And it explains something I've been wondering about." "What's that?" "Why I find our conversations so engaging. You embody that same quality, the ability to be completely logical and utterly unpredictable simultaneously. It's refreshing." Marcus felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the garden's climate control. "I'm not sure that's a compliment." "It absolutely is," Queen Lyralii assured him. "Do you know how rare it is to meet someone who challenges your assumptions while making you feel completely comfortable? Most beings are either comfortingly predictable or uncomfortably alien. You manage to be both familiar and surprising." They resumed walking, entering a section where the plants seemed to respond to their presence, leaves turning to track their movement like slow, vegetal eyes. "Your Majesty," Marcus began, then caught himself. Lyralii, may I ask you something personal? She raised an eyebrow at his use of her name, but didn't correct him. Of course. What's it like being a queen? I mean, beyond the obvious responsibilities and ceremonial duties. What's it like to be you? The question seemed to surprise her. She was quiet for several moments as they walked deeper into the gardens. Lonely, she said finally. That's not something I've ever said aloud before, but it's the truest answer I can give. Power creates distance, even when you don't want it to. People see the crown before they see the person wearing it. They hear my words through the filter of my position. Even my closest advisors are careful to disagree with me only in the most respectful terms. Marcus nodded, understanding flooding through him. That's why you enjoyed the compliment about your eyes. I wasn't talking to Queen Lyralii of the Zephyrian Dominion. I was just talking to you. Exactly. She smiled, and Marcus was struck again by how much more beautiful she was when the expression was genuine rather than diplomatic. Do you know, in 300 years of rule, you're the first person to use my given name in casual conversation? Even my family defaults to titles in formal settings. 300 years, Marcus repeated. I keep forgetting how long-lived your species is. What was it like watching centuries pass? Seeing changes unfold over timescales that humans can barely comprehend. Fascinating and melancholy in equal measure, Lyralii replied. You watch civilizations rise and transform, see technologies develop that seemed impossible in your youth, witness the birth and death of stars. But you also watch friends age and die while you remain. You become a living repository of history, but sometimes that history feels more real than the present. Marcus tried to imagine the weight of such temporal perspective and found his mind struggling with the concept. It must give you an incredible long-term view of events. It does, but it can also make it difficult to appreciate the immediate moment. When you've seen 1,000 diplomatic negotiations, it's easy to focus on patterns rather than the unique elements of each situation. You've helped remind me to pay attention to the present. They had reached the heart of the Memory Gardens, where a circular clearing contained a single structure that seemed to shift between architectural styles as Marcus watched. Sometimes it appeared to be made of earthstone, sometimes Zephyrian crystal, sometimes materials he couldn't identify. The center of understanding, Lyralii explained. It reflects the observer's concept of peace and contemplation. No two beings see it the same way. Marcus stared at the structure, watching it cycle through forms that felt familiar and alien by turns. What do you see when you look at it? A synthesis, Lyralii said softly. Elements from all the worlds I've known, combined in ways that shouldn't work but do. Recently, it's been incorporating architectural elements I've never seen before. I suspect they're from your home world, influenced by our conversations. The implications of that observation sent a small thrill through Marcus. Our conversations are affecting how you see things. More than I expected, she admitted. You've awakened something I thought I'd lost long ago. Curiosity about individual perspectives rather than species-wide patterns. Excitement about unpredictable interactions. The pleasure of being surprised by someone. Marcus found himself moving closer to her, drawn by something in her expression that went beyond mere diplomatic interest. Lyralii, I should probably tell you something. Yes. I've been looking forward to our meetings more than I should. As your liaison, I mean. It probably isn't entirely professional. Instead of stepping away or reminding him of proper boundaries, Lyralii smiled, that genuine smile again. Marcus, do you remember what I told you about honesty being rare in diplomatic circles? Yes. It's even rarer when it involves personal feelings, especially when those feelings are mutual. Marcus felt his heart skip a beat. Mutual. I've been finding excuses to schedule meetings we don't technically need, Lyralii confessed. I've been looking forward to your perspective on issues that I could easily handle without consultation. I've been wondering what it would be like to spend time with you away from the constraints of our official roles. The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with possibilities and complications. Marcus was acutely aware of the vast differences between them, in age, in species, in position, in virtually every meaningful category except the growing connection he felt whenever they were together. "This is complicated," he said finally. "Extremely," Lyralii agreed. "I'm a queen. You're a human. I've lived for centuries while you've barely started your adult life by your species standards. I have responsibilities to millions of subjects across dozens of worlds. You have a career to build and a life to live. But I've never felt this interested in another being's thoughts and perspectives. I've never found myself eager to share my own thoughts so freely. I've never looked forward to someone's presence the way I look forward to yours." Marcus stepped closer, close enough to see the complex patterns that moved slowly across her skin, close enough to catch the faint scent that reminded him of thunderstorms and starlight. "So what do we do about it?" he asked. "I don't know," Lyralii admitted. "In 3 centuries, I've never faced this particular diplomatic challenge." Marcus laughed, surprising himself. Maybe that's the point. Maybe some things don't have diplomatic solutions. Maybe some things just require 2 people figuring it out as they go. 2 people, Lyralii repeated thoughtfully. Not a queen and her subject. Not a diplomat and his counterpart. Just 2 people. Just 2 people who happen to find each other interesting, Marcus confirmed. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, surrounded by the gentle sounds of the memory gardens and the soft light emanating from the center of understanding. Marcus felt as though he was balanced on the edge of something momentous, a decision that would reshape not just his time on the station, but potentially his entire future. "Lyralii," he said quietly, "would you like to have dinner with me? Not a diplomatic meeting, not a cultural briefing, just dinner. 2 people sharing a meal and conversation." The smile that spread across her features was radiant. "I would like that very much. Though I should warn you, my dietary requirements are quite different from human norms." "I'm sure the station's food service can handle the challenge," Marcus replied. "After all, they're supposed to be diplomatic specialists." "Tomorrow evening, then," Lyralii suggested. "My quarters have a dining area that overlooks the nebula. The view is particularly beautiful at that time of cycle." "Tomorrow evening," Marcus agreed, feeling a mixture of anticipation and nervousness that reminded him of his first day at the Diplomatic Academy. As they made their way back through the memory gardens, Marcus found himself noticing details he'd missed on the way in. The way different sections seemed to complement each other despite representing completely alien environments. The careful balance between natural growth and conscious design. The sense that this was a place where different worlds could coexist and find common ground. Perhaps, he thought, it was a fitting place to begin exploring whether 2 very different beings could do the same. Marcus stood before the mirror in his quarters, adjusting his collar for the 5th time in as many minutes. He'd changed clothes 3 times, finally, settling on something that he hoped struck the right balance between formal and casual. The human wardrobe he'd brought to the station suddenly felt woefully inadequate for dinner with a centuries-old alien queen, regardless of how relaxed their relationship had become. The past month since their conversation in the memory gardens had brought a subtle but profound shift in their interactions. Their official meetings continued as before, but they'd also begun spending time together in ways that had nothing to do with diplomatic necessity. Lyralii had shown him the station's observation decks during the spectacular aurora phenomena that occurred when the nebula's electromagnetic fields aligned with the local star. He'd introduced her to human music, watching in fascination as she listened to everything from classical symphonies to modern electronic compositions with the same intense focus she brought to treaty negotiations. Tonight felt different, though, more intentional, more like an acknowledgement of whatever was growing between them rather than a casual extension of their working relationship. A soft chime indicated that it was time to leave for Lyralii's quarters. Marcus took one last look at his reflection, decided he looked as ready as he was ever going to be, and headed out into the corridor. The station's evening cycle had dimmed the lighting to simulate twilight, and the corridors were quieter than usual. Most of the diplomatic staff had retired to their quarters or gathered in the various social areas that catered to different species' recreational needs. Marcus found himself grateful for the relative solitude as he made his way to the royal residential section of the station. Lyraliai's quarters were located in a part of the station he'd never visited before, where the corridors widened and the architecture became more flowing and organic. The walls here seemed to pulse gently with their own light, and the air carried hints of the same thunderstorm scent he'd begun to associate with her presence. When he arrived at her door, Marcus hesitated for a moment before activating the chime. Almost immediately, the entrance dissolved to reveal Lyraliai waiting just inside. She had abandoned her usual formal robes in favor of something that looked like it was woven from captured starlight. The garment shifted and flowed as she moved, sometimes opaque, sometimes translucent, always beautiful. Her hair, which she usually wore in elaborate ceremonial styles, hung loose around her shoulders like a curtain of liquid silver. "Marcus," she said, and her smile contained warmth that had nothing diplomatic about it. "Welcome." Her quarters were a revelation. Where Marcus had expected more of the crystalline formality he associated with Zephyrian design, he found a space that felt remarkably intimate and personal. The main room flowed seamlessly from conversation area to dining space to what appeared to be a study filled with books and artifacts from dozens of different worlds. The far wall was entirely transparent, offering an unobstructed view of the nebula that provided the perfect backdrop for the evening. "This is beautiful," Marcus said, genuinely awed. "It's not what I expected." "What did you expect?" Lyraliai asked, leading him toward the dining area. "Something more formal, I suppose. More royal." "Those quarters exist," she said with amusement. "The formal receiving chambers where I conduct official business are exactly as formal and royal as you might imagine. These are my private spaces, where I can be myself rather than my position." The dining area was arranged around a low table that seemed to be carved from a single piece of crystallized nebula gas. Cushioned seating surrounded it, designed to accommodate the different physical requirements of various species. The table itself was set with what appeared to be living dishes, plates, and bowls that shifted color gently, responding to the temperature and composition of whatever they contained. "The food will be interesting," Lyraliai said, noting his examination of the place settings. "I took the liberty of requesting dishes that would work for both our species' dietary needs." The station's culinary staff was quite excited by the challenge. As if summoned by her words, several serving constructs glided into the room, carrying dishes that looked like small works of art. Marcus watched in fascination as plates of food that seemed to glow with internal light were arranged before them. "This one," Lyraliai said, indicating a dish that looked like crystallized honey, is a traditional Zephyrian delicacy made from pollinating insects that feed on quantum flowers. It's been modified to be safe for human consumption, though it retains the property of tasting different to each individual based on their emotional state. Marcus eyed the dish uncertainly. "What will it taste like if I'm nervous?" "Only one way to find out," Lyraliai said with a mischievous smile. Marcus took a careful bite and was surprised to find it tasted like warm honey mixed with something that reminded him of summer rain. As he ate, the flavor shifted subtly, becoming more complex and satisfying. "The nervousness is fading," Lyraliai observed. "Good. I was hoping you'd feel comfortable here." The other dishes proved equally fascinating. Foods that changed temperature as you ate them, maintaining the perfect warmth throughout the meal. Beverages that sparkled with captured starlight and tasted like liquid music. Fruits from worlds Marcus had never heard of that dissolved on the tongue, while leaving behind flavors that lingered for minutes. As they ate, their conversation flowed with the same easy rhythm that had characterized their recent interactions. They discussed the ongoing implementation of the Meridian Accords, the various challenges of managing a multi-species diplomatic community, and the surprisingly complex logistics of maintaining the memory gardens. But underneath the comfortable topics, Marcus was aware of a growing sense of intimacy that had nothing to do with the subjects they were discussing. "Can I ask you something?" Marcus said as they finished the main course. "Always. What do your advisors think about this?" He gestured between them, encompassing the dinner, the informal setting, and the obvious personal nature of their interaction. Lyralii was quiet for a moment, swirling a glass of something that looked like liquid sapphire. "My advisors are concerned about many things. They worry about the precedent of a queen taking personal interest in a representative from a newly integrated species. They worry about the political implications of what might be perceived as favoritism toward humanity. They worry about the practical complications of any kind of personal relationship between beings of such different lifespans and biological requirements. Those all sound like reasonable concerns," Marcus said carefully. "They are," Lyralii agreed. "From a purely political standpoint, my advisors are absolutely correct to be worried. Any personal relationship I form has potential political ramifications, especially with someone in your position." Marcus felt his heart sink slightly. "So they've advised you to end whatever this is?" "They have," Lyralii confirmed. "Several times, in increasingly urgent terms. My chief advisor has suggested that I transfer you to a different posting, somewhere that wouldn't require regular contact between us." The thought of being transferred away from the station, away from the work he'd grown to love, and especially away from Lyralii, filled Marcus with a sense of loss he hadn't expected. "And what have you told them?" he asked. Lyralii set down her glass and looked directly at him, her star-filled eyes serious. "I've told them that their concerns are noted and will be taken into consideration. And then I've ignored their advice completely." Marcus blinked. "You have?" "Marcus, I've been queen for 300 years. I've negotiated treaties that shaped the political landscape of dozens of star systems. I've made decisions that affected the lives of billions of beings. I've sacrificed personal desires for a political necessity more times than I can count. And in all that time, I've never found anything that made me question whether those sacrifices were worth it." She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "Until now," she continued, "for the first time in my reign, I found someone that makes me wonder what my life might be like if I prioritized my own happiness alongside my duties as a ruler." Marcus felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the exotic foods they'd been sharing. "Lyralii, I'm not saying it will be simple," she said quickly. "The complications my advisors worry about are real. The political challenges will be significant. The practical obstacles are daunting. But I've realized that some things are worth facing complications for." Marcus reached across the table and took her hand, marveling at the way her skin seemed to warm under his touch. "I feel the same way. I know this is probably the most complicated situation I could possibly get myself into, but I can't bring myself to care about the complications. Even if it means your career could be affected, even if other species might view your position here differently, even if some humans might see your relationship with an alien queen as a betrayal of your own species." Marcus had considered all of those possibilities, lying awake in his quarters during the past few weeks as their relationship had deepened. Each concern was valid, each potential consequence real. "Even then," he said firmly, "Lyralii, I've spent my entire adult life trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my future. I tried different careers, different paths, always feeling like I was searching for something I couldn't quite identify. And then I met you, and for the first time, I know exactly what I want, which is to spend as much time as possible in conversations like this, to learn more about your perspective on the universe, to share my own thoughts with someone who actually finds them interesting rather than simply tolerable, to be part of whatever we're building together, regardless of how complicated it gets." Lyralii smiled, and Marcus was struck by how much her expression had changed since that first night at the signing ceremony. The careful diplomatic mask had been completely replaced by something genuine and warm and entirely focused on him. "There's something I should tell you," she said. Something about Zephyrian culture that might affect how you think about this situation. Marcus waited, suddenly nervous about what cultural complexity he might have missed. In our culture, when someone pays a sincere compliment about another person's eyes, it's not just acknowledgement of physical beauty. It's recognition of spiritual compatibility. Eyes, for us, reflect the deep self, the part of a being that remains constant regardless of external circumstances. When you complimented my eyes that first night, you were unknowingly performing what we consider a form of courtship ritual. Marcus stared at her. I was what? Declaring your recognition of me as a potential life partner, Lyralii said, clearly enjoying his shocked expression. And when I asked you to say it again, I was accepting that declaration. So we've been courting for weeks without my knowing it? Technically, yes. Though I should clarify that the ritual is only considered complete when both parties understand what they're participating in. So consider this my formal explanation of the cultural significance and your opportunity to decide whether you want to continue participating in Zephyrian courtship customs. Marcus felt his mind reeling with the implications. What does completing the ritual involve? The formal exchange of what you might think of as promises. Declarations of intent to build a shared future despite whatever obstacles might arise. Acceptance of each other not just as they are now, but as they might become over time. The weight of what she was describing settled over Marcus like a warm blanket. It wasn't just a casual relationship or even a serious romance. It was a commitment to face the future together, whatever that future might hold. Lyralii, he said slowly, are you asking me to marry you? In a Zephyrian sense? I'm asking if you want to complete the courtship ritual we accidentally began, she said gently, which is similar to marriage, but carries different implications for our respective species. For me, it would be a commitment to share my extremely long life with you. However, much of it we have together. For you, it would be a commitment to accept that your life will be very different from what you originally planned. Marcus thought about his original plans for his life. The diplomatic career he'd stumbled into rather than chosen. The vague ideas about eventually returning to Earth to settle down with someone safe and familiar. The assumption that his future would follow predictable patterns. None of it seemed important anymore compared to the possibility of building something extraordinary with this remarkable being who had somehow come to care about his thoughts and feelings as much as he cared about hers. Yes, he said simply. I want to complete the ritual. I want to make those promises. I want to build a shared future, complications, and all. Lyralii's smile was radiant. Then, we should probably discuss what that future might look like, because I have some ideas that I think you'll find very interesting. As the evening continued, and they talked late into the station's night cycle, Marcus realized that his accidental compliment had led to something far more profound than he could have imagined. He'd stumbled into a life that bore no resemblance to anything he'd planned, and he couldn't be happier about it. Outside the transparent wall of Lyralii's quarters, the nebula continued its ancient dance among the stars, beautiful and unpredictable and perfectly suited to frame the beginning of something entirely new. 2 years had passed since the night Marcus and Lyralii completed their Zephyrian courtship ritual, and the diplomatic station had become something neither of them had originally envisioned. What started as a simple trade coordination facility had evolved into the galaxy's premier center for interspecies cultural exchange, largely due to what the galactic media had dubbed the human factor. Marcus stood in the newly completed Human Cultural Center, watching as beings from 17 different species participated in what appeared to be organized chaos. In one corner, a group of Centaurian diplomats were learning to play what humans called poker, their multiple eyes giving them a distinct advantage in reading tells, while their inability to understand human concepts of bluffing put them at an equal disadvantage. Near the center of the room, several Zephyrian youngsters were engaged in a heated debate about human music with a pair of elderly academics from the Rigel Collective, their argument punctuated by increasingly loud examples of different musical genres. The afternoon cultural exchange is going well, Lyralii said, approaching from behind with the silent grace that still occasionally startled him. Define well, Marcus replied, watching as Andromedan philosopher attempted to explain the concept of existential dread to a cluster of beings whose species had never developed concepts of mortality. I'm not sure whether what's happening over there constitutes cultural exchange or psychological warfare. Both, probably, Lyralii said with amusement, which makes it quintessentially human in its approach. The Human Cultural Center had been Lyralii's idea, though she presented it as a logical extension of Marcus's success as a cultural liaison. Over the past 2 years, his unconventional approach to diplomacy had produced results that surprised everyone, including himself. Rather than following established protocols for cultural integration, Marcus had simply started introducing other species to human customs in whatever way felt natural at the moment. The breakthrough had come during what was supposed to be a routine trade negotiation between Earth and the Tau Ceti Consortium. When negotiations had stalled over seemingly irreconcilable differences in commercial philosophy, Marcus had suggested they take a break and share a meal. What followed was 3 hours of informal conversation over pizza and beer, during which the various negotiators discovered they had more in common than their formal position suggested. The final agreement had been signed on napkins from the station's informal dining area, and news of the unconventional approach had spread throughout the diplomatic community. The Andromedan delegation wants to schedule a formal session on human approaches to conflict resolution, Lyralii said, reviewing a tablet that contained the day's requests. Apparently, word has reached them about your success with the mining guild dispute. Marcus winced at the memory. The mining guild conflict had been his most challenging assignment to date, involving a 3-way territorial dispute between species whose concepts of property ownership were so fundamentally different that traditional arbitration had been impossible. Marcus's solution had been to introduce all parties to the human children's game of rock, paper, scissors, which led to a tournament that somehow evolved into a complex negotiation framework based on chance, strategy, and mutual respect for arbitrary rules. I'm still not sure there was diplomacy so much as organized insanity, Marcus said. The best diplomacy often is, Lyralii replied. Your species has a talent for finding solutions that work despite making no logical sense. It's become one of humanity's most valuable contributions to galactic politics. Marcus was about to respond when a commotion near the entrance drew their attention. A group of beings he didn't recognize were arguing with the Cultural Center's reception staff, their voices rising in what sounded like multiple languages simultaneously. Who are they? Marcus asked. Lyralii's expression grew serious. Hegemony representatives. This is unexpected. The hegemony was one of the few major galactic powers that had refused to participate in the Meridian Accords, viewing the multi-species cooperation model as inefficient and potentially dangerous. They governed through rigid hierarchies and standardized protocols that had remained unchanged for millennia, and they regarded human unpredictability as a threat to galactic stability. Marcus watched as the lead hegemony representative, a tall being with silver-scaled skin and eyes like chips of obsidian, scanned the cultural center with obvious disapproval. The being's gaze lingered on the various groups engaged in their chaotic cultural exchanges, and Marcus could practically see him cataloging everything as evidence of human unsuitability for galactic civilization. Should I handle this? Marcus asked. We both should, Lyralii said. But remember, hegemony protocols require specific forms of address and very formal interaction patterns. This won't be like your usual approach to diplomacy. They approached the group together, and Marcus tried to project the kind of formal dignity that hegemony representatives would expect. The lead being noticed their approach and turned to address them with movements that were precisely controlled and utterly without spontaneity. I am Sub-Administrator Vexthal of the Hegemony Evaluation Division, the being said in a voice like grinding metal. We have been dispatched to assess the irregularities reported in this facility's operations. Your Excellency, Lyralii replied, falling automatically into formal diplomatic mode. We welcome the hegemony's interest in our operations. I am Queen Lyralii of the Zephyrian Dominion, and this is Cultural Liaison Marcus Chan of Earth. Sub-Administrator Vexthal's obsidian eyes fixed on Marcus with an intensity that felt distinctly unfriendly. Ah yes, the human. We have received multiple reports about your unconventional methods. I hope those reports have been favorable, Marcus said, trying to match Lyraliai's formal tone. They have been disturbing, Vexthal replied bluntly. Galactic diplomacy has operated according to established principles for 12,000 years. These principles exist because they work. They provide predictability, stability, and clear frameworks for resolving disputes between species with different values and customs. That's true, Marcus acknowledged, though sometimes different approaches can complement traditional methods. Different approaches introduce chaos, Vexthal said firmly. Your species' tendency toward unpredictable behavior is precisely the kind of destabilizing factor that the hegemony exists to prevent. We have come to evaluate whether this facility represents a threat to galactic stability. Marcus felt a chill of understanding. This wasn't just a routine inspection. The hegemony was considering whether to take action against the diplomatic station and its unconventional approaches to interspecies relations. Perhaps, Lyraliai interjected smoothly, you would allow us to demonstrate how our methods work in practice? We have several ongoing cultural exchange programs that might interest your evaluation team. We will observe, Vexthal agreed coldly, though I suspect we will find exactly what our preliminary report suggested. The human unpredictability creates more problems than it solves. What followed was one of the most stressful afternoons of Marcus's career. The hegemony evaluation team shadowed him through his various duties, taking detailed notes on everything from the informal way he conducted meetings to his tendency to use humor to defuse tense situations. Every interaction was scrutinized, every deviation from traditional protocol recorded as evidence of the chaos that humans supposedly introduced to galactic affairs. The situation reached a crisis point during the daily mediation session for minor disputes. Marcus was helping resolve a disagreement between two minor species over shipping lane priorities, using his usual approach of getting both sides to explain their positions informally while he looked for creative compromises. This is precisely what we mean, Sub-Administrator Vexthal announced, interrupting the session. Look at this chaos. No formal procedures, no standardized protocols, no predictable framework for resolution. How can any being trust a system that operates on such arbitrary principles? Marcus felt his temper flare, though he tried to keep it under control. The system works. Both parties leave satisfied with the resolution. This time, Vexthal said dismissively, but what happens when your improvised methods fail? What happens when unpredictability leads to conflict instead of resolution? What happens when beings who expect stability find only chaos? Then we adapt and find a different approach, Marcus replied. That's what humans do. We improvise. We try new things. We accept that not every situation has a perfect solution, so we look for good enough solutions that everyone can live with. Exactly. Vexthal's voice rose to something approaching triumph. You accept imperfection. You embrace chaos. You introduce uncertainty into systems that require stability to function. This is precisely why human involvement in galactic affairs is dangerous. Marcus looked around the room at the various beings who had paused their activities to watch the confrontation. He saw Centaurians who had been learning human games, Zephyrians who had been debating human philosophy, and representatives from a dozen other species who had found value in the cultural center's unconventional approaches. Suddenly, something clicked in his mind. The same instinct that had led him to compliment Lyraliai's eyes, that had guided him through 2 years of successful cultural mediation, suggested a completely different approach to this confrontation. Sub-Administrator Vexthal, Marcus said, his voice taking on a formal tone that surprised everyone, including himself. You're absolutely right. The room fell silent. Lyraliai shot him a concerned look, while the hegemony representative looked suspicious at the sudden agreement. Humans are unpredictable, Marcus continued. We do introduce chaos into stable systems. We do improvise instead of following established protocols. We do accept imperfection as preferable to paralysis. Then you admit that human involvement in galactic affairs is destabilizing, Vexthal said. I admit that human involvement changes things, Marcus said carefully. The question is whether change is always bad, or whether sometimes stable systems need a little chaos to remain healthy. He gestured around the room at the various cultural exchanges taking place. Look at what's happening here. Yes, it's chaotic. Yes, it's unpredictable. But it's also produced more successful interspecies cooperation in 2 years than this sector had achieved in the previous century. Temporary success built on unstable foundations, Vexthal argued. Maybe, Marcus acknowledged. Or maybe stability without adaptation is just stagnation wearing a fancy name. Marcus took a deep breath and made a decision that would either prove his point or end his diplomatic career. Sub-administrator, you've spent the day cataloging all the ways human methods violate established protocols. But have you considered the possibility that established protocols might benefit from occasional violation? The protocols exist for good reasons, Vexthal said stiffly. I'm sure they do, Marcus agreed. But so does the human tendency to question whether good reasons are always. The question is whether the galaxy benefits from having access to different approaches when traditional ones aren't working. Sub-Administrator Vexthal was quiet for a long moment, his obsidian eyes fixed on Marcus with an expression that was impossible to read. You were suggesting, he said finally, that chaos has value as a diplomatic tool. I'm suggesting that what looks like chaos might actually be a different kind of order, Marcus replied. One that's flexible enough to adapt to situations that rigid protocols can't handle. And you believe this flexible order contributes to galactic stability? Marcus thought about all the conflicts he'd helped resolve over the past 2 years. All the relationships he'd helped build between species who had previously been unable to communicate effectively. I believe it contributes to something better than stability, he said. I believe it contributes to growth. The silence that followed was profound. Around the room, beings from multiple species waited to see how the confrontation would resolve. Marcus was acutely aware that his answer might determine not just his own future, but the future of the cultural center and the entire experimental approach to diplomacy it represented. Finally, Sub-Administrator Vexthal spoke. The hegemony will require a full report on our observations here, he said formally. That report will include recommendations regarding whether this facility represents a threat to galactic stability or a resource for galactic development. He paused, and for the first time since his arrival, his expression seemed slightly less rigid. However, he continued, our preliminary observations suggest that human unpredictability, while disruptive to traditional protocols, may indeed serve a useful function in certain diplomatic contexts. The hegemony values thorough analysis over quick judgment. Marcus felt a wave of relief wash over him. Does that mean the cultural center can continue operating? It means the cultural center will be placed under extended observation to determine the long-term effects of its methods, Vexthal replied. But, yes, operations will continue. As the hegemony evaluation team departed, Marcus found himself surrounded by the various beings who had been participating in the day's cultural exchanges. To his surprise, several of them approached to express support for the unconventional methods that had just been challenged. Marcus, Lyralii said, appearing at his side as the crowd began to disperse. That was either brilliant diplomacy or the most elaborate form of professional suicide I've ever witnessed. I'm not sure there's a difference, Marcus replied, feeling suddenly exhausted. Did I just save the cultural center or doom it to eternal scrutiny? Both, probably, Lyralii said with a smile, which makes it a perfectly human solution to an impossible problem. That evening, they stood together on the observation deck of Lyralii's quarters, watching the nebula's colors shift in the light of the local star. The past 2 years had transformed both their relationship and their understanding of what was possible when beings from different worlds chose to build something together rather than simply coexist. Do you ever regret it? Marcus asked, choosing chaos over stability. Every day, Lyralii replied without hesitation. And I've never been happier about any decision I've ever made. Marcus smiled, understanding completely. Their life together was unpredictable, complicated, and frequently chaotic. It was also more fulfilling than either of them had imagined possible. So what happens now? He asked. Now we keep doing what we've been doing, Lyralii said. We adapt. We improvise. We build something new together and see what happens next. Even if the hegemony is watching our every move. Especially then, Lyralii replied. After all, someone needs to show them that chaos isn't the opposite of order. Sometimes it's just order that's flexible enough to grow. As they stood together, watching the ancient dance of stars and gas clouds, Marcus reflected on the strange path that had brought him here. An accidental compliment had led to an unexpected friendship, which had grown into an unlikely romance, which had evolved into a partnership that was reshaping how different species interacted with each other. It was chaotic, unpredictable, and completely improvised. In other words, it was perfectly human. And for the first time in his life, Marcus was proud of what that meant. Outside their window, the nebula continued its eternal dance, beautiful and chaotic and perfectly suited to frame the ongoing experiment in interspecies cooperation that had grown from a simple human tendency to speak honestly about what he saw. Sometimes, Marcus thought, the most profound changes began with the smallest gestures. After all, he had just complimented a queen's eyes. Everything else had followed from there.